Welcome to the Reasonable Christianity Podcast, a weekly podcast where you get to discover the truth claims, teachings, and practices of Christianity. Here's your host, Roland. Hello and welcome back to the Reasonable Christianity Podcast. As always, my name is Roland, and in today's episode, we continue with the series that we've been doing for the last few weeks. Now, as you might remember, in the previous episodes, we looked at the cosmological and the teleological arguments for the existence of God. The arguments can be summed up or summarized as follows. The cosmological argument. The first premise says, everything that had a beginning had a cause. The second premise says, the universe had a beginning. The conclusion is, therefore, the universe had a cause. Then we also looked at the teleological argument, or the argument from design. The first premise says every design had a designer. Second premise, the universe has highly complex design. The conclusion is, therefore, the universe had a designer. Now, I recommend that you visit or revisit the previous episodes if you want to consider these evidences again, or just familiarize yourself with these arguments again. Now, in today's episode, we are going to discuss and consider the moral argument for the existence of God. Now, the debate between theism and atheism has been going on for centuries, with one of the most contentious points being the debate about morality. On the one hand, theists argue that moral or objective moral values can only exist if there is a divine moral lawgiver. The argument goes like this. Every law has a lawgiver. That's the first premise. The second premise is there is a moral law. The conclusion, therefore, there is a moral lawgiver. Now, as with all sound philosophical arguments, the conclusion is necessarily true if the first and second premises are true. Now, on the other hand, the atheist claims that morality can be understood and justified without the need for a higher power. But this raises crucial questions. If there's no divine moral lawgiver, how can we have objective moral values? If morality is simply a product of human evolution or cultural development, how can we justify the idea that certain actions are objectively wrong or objectively right? Now, the atheists, their best answer is that morality is based on human well-being. But this raises even more questions than answers. For instance, why should we prioritize human well-being above other considerations? Meaning, why is human well-being a good thing? Isn't this just a subjective preference? Furthermore, if morality is based on human well-being, how do we determine what constitutes well-being? Is it happiness, fulfillment, or something else entirely? And who gets to decide? Also, if morality is just a societal construct, how can we determine or how can we account for the universal moral norms that we find and that we see across different cultures and societies? On the atheist view, morality is relative to the individual or the culture. This is called moral relativism. However, if morality is entirely relative, how can we condemn certain actions as being objectively wrong? For instance, why was apartheid wrong if morality is simply a product of cultural norms or a matter of opinion? Now, in contrast, if morality is grounded in the nature of God, then we have a basis for objective moral values. Why? Because if God is a perfect moral being, then certain actions are objectively right or wrong because they align or they contradict with God's nature. Okay? Now, at this point, I think it's important for us to make a few distinctions. Firstly, we must distinguish between moral values and moral duties. According to William Lane Craig, this is a quote, he says, when we speak of moral values, we are talking about whether something is good or bad. And when we are talking about moral duties, we are concerned with whether something is right or wrong. Now, we might be excused to think, or in thinking that right and wrong, or right is the same as good. We might equate right with what is good. and we might equate what is wrong with what is bad. But we need to know that these things are not, strictly speaking, these things are not the same. Dr. Lane Craig continues forward by saying, right and wrong have to do with moral obligation in terms of what I ought to do. But obviously, I'm not obligated to do something just because it is good for me to do it. For example, it is good to become a school teacher. However, this doesn't mean that it is my duty to become a school teacher. Also, there are some instances where when doing what is good might conflict with doing what is right. For example, if someone breaks into my house, holds me at gunpoint and asks me who else is in the house, should I tell the robber that my wife and kids are also in the house, thereby obviously risking their lives as well? Of course not. I have no moral duty towards the robber, to be honest. So in this instance, the moral value of honesty conflicts with my moral duty to protect my family. So there is a conceptual difference between what is good, and sometimes even a practical difference between what is good and what is right, and also a difference between what is bad and what is wrong. The second distinction we need to make is between objective and subjective moral values and duties. So we've already gone through this when we were considering the nature of truth claims in previous episodes, so I won't belabor the point too much. However, I think it is important to remind ourselves that when we say something is objective, then we mean that it is independent of what people think or perceive. Therefore, to say that there are objective moral values is to say that something is good or evil independent of human perception or preference. Similarly, to say that we have objective moral duties is to say that certain actions are right or wrong, independent of whether human beings believe them to be so. For example, when we say the Holocaust, the fact that Nazis killed millions of Jews, when we say the Holocaust was objectively wrong, we are saying it was wrong even though the Nazis thought what they were doing was right. It would still have been wrong even if the Nazis won World War II, because it is objectively wrong. Okay, now let's get back to the argument. Let's look at premise 1 again. So premise 1 says, every law has a lawgiver. There can be no legislation unless there is legislature. Moreover, if there are moral obligations, there must be someone to be obligated to. This is obvious based on our experience. Whether we are referring to the judicial arm of government or a local municipality council or even a school board, anytime we find laws and we trace them back to their source, we come to lawgivers. But the question is it true that there is a moral law? Is it true that there is a moral law? The second premise states there is a moral law. Now, the American Declaration of Independence says the following: we hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among those are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Now, the American founding fathers called these truths nature's law. Some might refer to them as natural law or conscience. Whatever you want to call them, they believe that these truths were self-evident. This means they are truths that are known intuitively, not discovered by logic or by science. So when we say the moral law exists, we mean that all people are impressed with a fundamental sense of right and wrong. Everyone knows, for example, that love is superior to hate and that courage is better than cowardice. C.S. Lewis puts it like this. He says, and I quote, "Think of a country where people are admired for running away in battle, or where a man felt proud of double-crossing all the people who had been kindest to him. You might just as well try to imagine a country where 2 and 2 made 5. In other words, everyone knows there are absolute moral obligations, which is to say there is an absolute moral law. This means there is absolute moral obligation that is always binding on all people. And an absolute moral law implies and points to an absolute moral lawgiver. Now, this does obviously not mean that all moral questions are easily answered. It also does not mean that people don't deny the existence of the moral law. It just means that the moral law exists even though people might suppress the truth of its existence or might find it hard to navigate through some moral issues. Now, J. Warner Wallace has a nice way of demonstrating the objectivity of morality. Here's a clip.
What's the best explanation for moral laws?
I think all of us accept certain moral truths, and we get those from someplace. I mean, you have your own personal views on something. I've worked gangsters who had their own personal views on what was right and wrong that were very different than mine, very different than yours probably. And their gangs, a bigger group, had a certain set of laws, and if you wanted to be part of that, you took on those laws. But we all live in a city that has certain laws, and we fall underneath that. So you could get your views from people, but that's, of course, we might disagree. You can get your views from groups or governments, but governments and groups disagree. But there are some laws that transcend all of us. They really aren't grounded in individuals or groups because they transcend individuals and groups. There are some things we disagree about and some things we agree altogether. Even before there were people, we agreed probably that it was never okay to torture people for fun. You might have some sense of when it might be okay to torture people, I can't even imagine. But if you did, it was certainly never for fun. So if this rule was in place, it was in place, if this idea, this concept of morality was in place, if you believe in a Star Trek universe, that rule doesn't only apply to us as humans, it applies to every other race of aliens. It transcends not only the individual, the group, the nation, the planet, the species. Wow, where could such a transcendent, objective moral law come from? What is the authority that transcends all of this that could provide for such things? It seems to me the best and most reasonable source, grounding for those kinds of transcendent views is in a transcendent lawgiver, a transcendent source, who doesn't create these views willy-nilly. And he's not just describing views that existed before him. He's the actual source of such truth because they're simply a reflection of his divine nature. If that's the case, I think we can properly ground objective, transcendent moral values that we all agree exist, or most of us agree, especially when pushed to the example I just gave. Yet we don't want to agree on how they can be grounded.
That's awesome. You see, just by adding the words for fun, we run face first into moral absolutes. It is wrong to torture babies for fun. This is true for all people of all times. Now, there are obviously many reasons why we know the moral law exists. Dr. Frank Turek and Dr. Norman Geisler list 8 of these reasons in their book. The book is called I Don't Have Enough Faith to Be an Atheist. The 8 reasons are listed as follows. They say the moral law is undeniable. Secondly, we know it by our reactions. Thirdly, it is the basis for human rights. Number 4, it is the unchanging standard for justice. Number 5, it defines the real difference between moral positions. Number 6, since we know what's absolutely wrong, there must be an absolute standard for rightness. Number 7, the moral law is the grounds for political and social dissent. Number 8, if there were no moral law, then we wouldn't make excuses for violating it. Now let's look at these reasons a little bit deeper. Firstly, the moral law is undeniable. Now, in previous episodes, we looked at some objections to truth. One of the objections was that there is no objective truth, or that all truth is relative. Now, we defeated this claim by pointing out that the claim all truth is relative is in itself an objective truth claim. So if there is no objective truth, then the claim is self-defeating. Similarly, if the claim all truth is relative is true, then there is at least one truth that is objectively true, which means all truth is relative can be true. Again, the claim defeats itself. We see a similar trend with people who deny the existence of objective values. Moral values are particularly undeniable or practically undeniable. You see, friend, the person who denies that there are any values in the world values his right to deny them. He wants everyone to value him as a person, to respect his rights, like the rights to freedom or freedom of speech, even while he denies that there are values for all persons. Now, secondly, the second reason we know that there is a moral law is that our reactions help us discover the moral law. Dr. Turek and Dr. Geisler make a great example to prove this point. They refer to an atheist student who wrote an ethics paper where he defended the idea that there are no absolute moral values or duties. So the student also provided evidence and documentation for his arguments. Now, when the professor was grading the paper, the professor wrote the following on the front cover of the student's paper. The professor wrote, F, I don't like blue folders. The student was outraged and claimed that the professor had treated him unfairly by giving him a grade based on the professor's preference instead of a grade that is based on the merits of the student's arguments and evidence. The student's reaction betrayed his real belief. There are moral absolutes. People may claim to be moral relativists, but they are really not. For example, I might think that there's nothing wrong with stealing from others until someone actually steals from me. Or some people, particularly men, might justify cheating on their wife while at the same time expecting their wife not to cheat on them. So while the moral law might not always be obvious by our actions, obviously we know this because we see it in the world. It's evidenced by the terrible things human beings do to each other. But the moral law is clearly revealed by our reactions when we are personally treated unfairly. The third reason why we know there's a moral law is that without the moral law, there would be no human rights. Let's refer to the American Declaration of Independence once more. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. So the founders of America believed that human rights are God-given, and as such, they are universal and absolute. These rights apply to all people in all places, always. This is consistent with the beliefs held by the Allied nations during World War II. So during World War II, or after World War II, the Nazis were tried at Nuremberg, and they were convicted of violating basic human rights as defined by the moral law, which is enshrined in what we call international law. These are laws that all nations of the world are subject to. Without a universal moral law, there can be no international law, and there would be no grounds for convicting the Nazis for their actions during World War II. We could not say that the Nazis were wrong unless we knew what was right. This leads us to the fourth reason. Without the moral law, we couldn't know justice from injustice. This extends to justice and injustice. If there are not objective human rights, then there can be no objective justice or injustice. One of the objections that people raise against the existence of God is the presence of evil or suffering in the world. So the objection goes like this. If there really is a good and just God, then why does He allow bad things to happen to good people? But again, C.S. Lewis counters this argument by saying the following. He says, my argument against God, while he was still an atheist, he says, my argument against God was that the universe seemed so cruel and unjust. But how had I got this idea of just and unjust? A man does not call a line crooked unless he has some idea of a straight line. What was I comparing the universe with when I called it unjust? This realization actually led C.S. Lewis out of atheism and ultimately to Christianity. And he was of course right. We can only detect injustice when comparing it to an independent and unchanging standard of justice. Indeed, you cannot know what is evil without knowing what is good. And you can't know what is good unless there is an unchanging standard of good outside yourself. Otherwise, any objection to evil is nothing more than your personal opinion. Okay, the fifth reason. Without the moral law, there would be no way to measure moral differences. If the moral law doesn't exist, then there is no moral difference between the behavior of Mother Teresa and that of Hitler. So here's a practical example. If I showed you two maps of South Africa, how would we know which map is a better representation of South Africa? We would obviously have to compare both maps to the real unchanging place called South Africa. If South Africa doesn't exist, then the maps are meaningless. Similarly, if there is no standard of right, then statements like murder is evil, racism is wrong, or you shouldn't abuse children have no objective meaning. They are simply a matter of opinion, like saying Vampire Diaries is a better series than the originals. Simple terms like good, bad, better, and worse are meaningless in a moral sense. We all know that such a conclusion would be absurd. Therefore, moral relativism can't be true. And if moral relativism is false, then objective morality does exist. Okay, the sixth reason why we know there is a moral law is without a moral law, you can't know what's right and wrong. So we've already referred to this principle when referencing the idea of justice and injustice, but I think it's worth mentioning again. You can't know if something is wrong without knowing what is right. For example, you can't know that 5 is the wrong answer when asking what 2 plus 2 equals, unless you have some idea of what the right answer is. And then the sixth reason we know about the moral law is without the moral law, there are no moral grounds for political and social dissent. So without a moral law, there would be nothing wrong with Christians or Muslims forcibly imposing their religion on atheists. There would be nothing wrong with banning freedom of religion. There would be nothing wrong with racism, gay bashing, or imperialistic wars. There would be no political rights at all because there would be no human rights. But we know that there are political rights. We know that racism is wrong. We know that gay bashing is wrong because there is a moral standard outside of ourselves that tells us that those behaviors are wrong. And the last reason that we know that there's a moral law is that if there were no moral law, then we wouldn't make excuses for violating it. Let me ask you a question. Why do people make excuses for immoral behavior? Making excuses is an indirect admission that the moral law exists. Why make excuses if no behavior is actually immoral? So in our culture, the number one virtue is tolerance. But even tolerance is a moral principle that indirectly indicates that there is a moral law. We all know that we only plead for people to tolerate bad behavior, not good behavior. No one needs to be talked into tolerating the behavior of Mother Teresa. Similarly, no one makes excuses for the behavior of Mother Teresa. We only make excuses when we act against the moral law. Okay, so in conclusion, we have established that the first and second premises hold true. Therefore, the conclusion follows necessarily. We've concluded that all laws come from lawgivers. We've also concluded by looking at the 8 reasons that the moral law exists, therefore, there is a moral lawgiver. Now, in the next episode, we will draw up a profile of the kind of cause that was responsible for the characteristics that we observe in our known universe. We will refer to the cosmological, teleological, and moral arguments to compile a definition of a cause or a creator that we will use as a reference point as we consider different worldviews going forward. Once again, thank you guys for listening. And until the next time, remember, the truth matters, and so do you.